The Atlanta Story is a podcast highlighting Atlanta's most interesting creators, entrepreneurs, and builders. I'm Jon Birdsong with Atlanta Ventures, and in today's episode, we have Mike Jordan, writer and editor. Over his 20-year career, Mike has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Rolling Stone Magazine, Atlanta Magazine, Creative Loafing, Playboy, the Huntsville Times, and much more. Born in Nashville, raised in Huntsville, a Morehouse Man, husband, girl dad, today he stays busy as editor-in-chief for Hypepotamus. In this episode, we talk about the current media landscape, working in startups, the Black Lives Matter movement today and beyond, his time at LaFace Records, and what it's like having a famous family member. We hope you enjoy the show and subscribe to the Atlanta Story. Mike Jordan, thank you for being on the Atlanta Story podcast today. Before we get started, Mike Jordan, you're a writer, editor. Over your 20 years career, you've been published in, most recently, a lot in the Wall Street Journal, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Thrillist, Time Out, Atlanta Magazine, Creative Loafing, Huntsville Times, and much more. Born in Nashville, raised in Huntsville, a Morehouse Man, husband, girl dad, and much more. Today, editor-in-chief of Hypepotamus and a regular Wall Street Journal contributor. Mike Jordan, thank you for joining us today for the Atlanta Story podcast.
Jon Birdsong, thank you for having me. I see we're on first name, last name basis, like J Money. That's an Atlanta joke for everybody out there around the South and wherever else who doesn't get it. I would only say that you left out saxophonist, which I realize I've been saying it wrong possibly because the radio station here, when they talk about a person that plays saxophone, they say saxophonist.
Yes.
So makes it fancy, but yeah, also play an instrument every now and then. But thank you for having me.
Absolutely, community builder with Lit, right? That'll come back as the coronavirus situation dissipates. I'm assuming that'll come back.
Yeah,
you know, so much to cover today. I mean, from food, culture, media, the works. And I'm really excited to share some time with you. So thank you again. Let's start off with really media and technology today, because that is becoming a very hot topic with the ever evolving landscape for folks in media, folks in technology. You know, they've been merging, they've been going back and forth, and how does media's role evolve as technology continues to progress?
All right. That is that question, and everyone always says that's a great question, but that is a great question because there's the intertwining of media and technology that we have seen since when I first began as a journalist, writer. This was the days of print journalism. So as we have gone into the digital age and figured out how to make that a thing, how that works with SEO, how that works with a revenue model, then how that may not work with a revenue model, different ideas of revenue. It's going to be really interesting to see. I don't know that there is a complete answer. I think we're in a real period of flux. Let's even think about this. As the coronavirus pandemic really, took hold end of February or so, you saw a lot of media cuts. And, there were layoffs, there were furloughs at first in some cases, but there were a significant amount of layoffs. And with those layoffs, it's funny because media itself is, in terms of traffic, doing outstandingly well. But in terms of the ad revenue, because so many companies are also having to make cuts, it's very similar to what happened in the Great Recession. Back then, that was really when you saw print finally starting to kind of lose a little bit of ground, even though it's still technically, I believe, more profitable. But I think technology plays a role in that. I think we're seeing the advent of the paid newsletter subscription model. We obviously have podcasts like this one. We have all types of different methods and ways. We have people like Butter ATL, who their media content is at the moment completely exclusively on Instagram. There's a whole new world of what media looks like with the advent of technology, and then there's also how does that even like work with each other when you're starting to report.
Right. So if you were to talk to someone who just graduated from college, who's going in to be a journalist, and they've trained for it, how would you? What words of advice would you give them, knowing what you've been through and what you see? Right, because you're someone that is pretty versatile when it comes to, I mean, all of the media properties that you've worked for over the years, where you've been published. I mean, you could write for anybody, versus some writers are more, they've been with the AJC for 30 years and like going out and like creating some sort of individual brand, maybe not be in their best talents and skill set, but where, knowing how media and technology have evolved, what's your take on what if someone's coming out of school today, what do you advise?
Flexibility, a lot of flexibility, and start from the position of flexibility. I was fortunate to kind of start in the same year. 1997 was when I started getting published, just writing album reviews and some business profiles as well of local leaders. This was at Rolling Out. And a lot of people, especially a lot of Black journalists, got their start at Rolling Out. So I always like to shout them out because they're still here. But then there's also copywriting. So I go back to the mid 90s of the music industry and interned my way from So Def Recordings. I was Lil Jon's A&R intern. So shout out to the king of crunk. But, I went from there to Hot 97.5 and interned with Ludacris and Lala and Ryan Cameron and all these Chris Lover and Poon Daddy, all that craziness. Yeah. And then worked my way to an internship at LaFace Records. Right. And they ended up hiring me full time in the marketing department. But between internship and full-time job, I actually ended up getting a copywriting contract because I used to just write creative things. If I had a quote, I was just trying to stand out. So the intern desk was right next to the senior vice president's corner office. And we all shared this one desk, but there was a whiteboard no one was using. So whenever I'd come in, I would write some type of quote that came off the top of my head. People started to notice it. My man, D.L. Warfield, who was the creative director at LaFace at the time, he noticed it. He went to L.A. Reid. They were like, well, let's give this guy a contract to write some marketing stuff for us. So I started at the same time working from what is news and then also what is copy, what is marketing, what is content marketing. We weren't calling it content marketing back then, but That's what it was. That's given me a flexibility that I continue to try to work out the same way you would go to the gym or continue to be on your workout regimen during a pandemic. I've throughout my career liked to keep myself in good shape to where it's not even just whether or not I end up needing a job over here or wherever I may go. It's just, it's good for the mind. It's an exercise of communication. And way too often you have journalists who think, oh, well, that's the dark side of the force over there or something. That's how you get to a place where, like you said, if you end up somewhere nowadays, you're not going to get the gold watch for 30 years, especially in media, especially if you're in the newspaper side. That business model is looking a little different. So why not find an ability to have range in your talents? So I would tell them that be flexible, start flexible, stay flexible.
Ironically, it's that mentality that now, I mean, you open up the Wall Street Journal and you see Mike Jordan, in the last couple months, you've been published there a few times, and it seems like it's just the beginning. What, from your career development, why Wall Street Journal now, right? And what attracted you to that opportunity?
So why now is a question that goes to being seasoned, I would say. This is, obviously, I think everyone would agree that it's a top 5 or top 3, and actually in paid circulation, it's number 1. I believe USA Today is the biggest, but I think Wall Street Journal is the biggest in terms of paid circulation. So Wall Street Journal is serious, and there's one thing. Of course, there's always those kids, for lack of a better term, who end up there early, and either they find themselves in a situation where they have an apprenticeship or an internship, and they get in, and that's great. But more often, you find your way into places like that through kind of networking, kind of getting to a place where you have clips. It's like credit. You don't get credit until you have credit, and then you have to build credit. So that's the way it is with a career. You need to get published, and you want to make good decisions about where you're going, so that when the opportunity comes and when your skill level is there, then you can end up in a place like that. But there's also a really interesting thing that I think a lot of journalists should always keep in mind with a publication like Wall Street is you don't want to get to the Wall Street Journal before it's your time to be in a publication like that. That's because you still have to deal with an editor. And no matter what that process looks like, which you don't want to come to the table being unprepared or not yet quite qualified. But then let's say you get all the way through the process, and that process is rigorous. If you want to find out if you're a journalist or not, get an assignment with the Wall Street Journal and get it from, idea and pitch to fruition. You will be fact checked. They will make sure, because they can't risk the reputation that they've built. But let's say that gets published. What if there's a flaw that no one saw, and next thing you know, your big opportunity to be at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, you got your byline, so your name is famous for something that maybe was just missed and was a bad thing, and just being too enthusiastic about the opportunity and not your readiness for the opportunity can really put you in a negative place. So there's that side. But I would say, the Wall Street Journal the opportunity came about, and I was interested in it because it came about in a way that I was in somewhat of not full control. It's still an editor's decision, but they allowed me to come up with some ideas.
Yeah.
And that's usually how it happens. You have to pitch, but even getting to the place of pitching takes some.
I mean, if you go and look at your muck rock, 240 articles, and I bet you that's only, 50% that they've cataloged. And so, you're beyond prolific. You've written for the AJC, Creative Loafing, several other local outlets. Let's bring it back to Atlanta. What is the current state of local media, and where do you see it evolving? Knowing that Curb has been cut, knowing that Creative Loafing is online, and not sure what's the state of local media in Atlanta. What's currently missing in local media
in Atlanta? And Atlanta's a really interesting market for that question, because I've actually had people tell me that Atlanta's not a real media market, and I won't argue that point. People have a right to their perspective, but even if you're looking for a position, if you're in between stations or media outlets, and you're looking for a job, you usually have Cox. You have, which can be the AJC, or it can be some other media properties they have. You may have Cumulus, which that's here or there sometimes. You might have iHeart, because they've kind of become in the market a little bit. Of course, there's CNN, but it always seems like CNN is a little iffy. They just sold CNN Center, right? So you don't really know, and there are limited opportunities here. So that's why it's important that Atlanta is really firm on deciding what it wants in the future of its media identity. And I think it is first, I have to be honest, I don't think that a lot of the journalism jobs that we have lost recently are going to come back. I honestly would tell you, and a lot of people would agree with this, the coronavirus was sort of a convenient means to get to an end of what some of these companies were going to do to be profitable. And some of them, they weren't insolvent, but they just wanted to get to a place to where it really made sense.
Right.
So a lot of those journalists are probably going to have to find new avenues to do their storytelling. Thankfully, we do have the internet. Thankfully, we do have podcasting. Thankfully, we do have newsletters and Medium on up to building your own property. But I think it's really going to go towards a nonprofit. I heard that that there's actually a bid out there for McClatchy to be completely bought and to become the nation's largest nonprofit news source. So
Yep.
the reason is because, as we see the ad revenue model, there are some vulnerabilities there. And we see that, all of these other ways, the event, because that had become a big thing, events and turning the media property into a brand of its own to where you could have, activations for companies. But even that, I mean, what are we doing with events right now? So I think it's going to have to become funded in a new way. And I think that the stories are going to become much more, I don't want to say honest, but a little bit more focused on what people consider to be real stories, because I think the appetite is changing right now.
Yep. Well, you and a couple local writers came out with a new kind of civic-minded outlet and publication called Canopy. Share a little bit more about the intent behind that and some of the goals there.
Yeah, thanks for asking about it. Canopy Atlanta is an idea that was sort of it originated, I believe, with one of our co-founders. There's 6 of us who co-founded Canopy Atlanta, and all journalists. But there's a wider group of support of journalists who have been around in Atlanta for a little while, who've had experiences in some of the major publications or the well-known ones, and are all sort of looking for something to change because we've seen that it's about that time. It came about Max Blau, who, if your audience is not familiar, look him up. Max Blau Blau. He's just through phenomenal journalist, and he's one of those people where when you read his stories, you come away feeling so much smarter and so much as if you wish that story would have gone on, because there's a richness of information and research and just proper treatment of a story. So he did a project where he worked on a story for the Pittsburgh community of Atlanta. And that story was printed on the front page of the AJC, I believe. And it had the bylines of community members who actually he helped to embed and to train and to report on what happens in their communities. And there's also a couple of other media companies that are similar to this. They're also nonprofits. There's a City Bureau out of Chicago, and there's some others that are starting to go by this model. But we were already thinking, well, what does that exist in Atlanta? And not really as of yet. So Canopy Atlanta, the goal is, instead of your usual media function of you go into a neighborhood in Atlanta or anywhere else really, but in Atlanta specifically, and there's the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. So you find people going in and there's the local news about, a shooting or some type of crime element or something maybe not as positive. It's not that Canopy Atlanta wants to turn the news positive. We want to have the community members in underserved neighborhoods of Atlanta throughout the 5-county metro region be part of the news delivery process themselves. And we don't mean a paper route and throwing a newspaper on your door. Right. We mean training these community members who have an interest in journalism, then publishing their works and putting them along the way. And the difference that we expect that to make is not only is journalism more about what the residents and the neighbors of that community know are the stories that really should be reported, positive or not, but then you're also not being extractive to where you come into that neighborhood and say, hey, there was a shooting on, English Avenue, news at 11. And then you're out of there because maybe you just don't want to get shot or whatever the case is. You're no longer there and you're not embedded. Now we're leaving a trail of embedded, trained journalists who know how to reach and get a story, research it properly, and deliver it in all of these neighborhoods that are underserved. And so you're creating a wider community, and that way they can launch their own newsletters or their own publications if they prefer. But it's just a new way of going about it that really takes the story back into the hands of those who live it and best.
Very innovative approach, and looking forward to following along.
First issue will be out fall, and we are going by different neighborhoods, and we are starting with the West End neighborhood of Atlanta.
Awesome. Mike, switching gears, in your current role as editor of Hypepotamus, um, you you not only cover early stage technology companies, but you also have been on the other side where you really helped build a team, own a market, and really grow a market with Thrillist, right? So what's the difference between covering startups versus working in them?
Wow. You hit it. That's when you cover startups, you have to be extremely, healthily skeptical, because there are a lot of things that start and never really go as far as the founders may expect or aspire for them to go. So it's good to have a little bit of skepticism. It helps you dig out a little bit of the truth and to really understand the story you're delivering. Being inside, you're actually thinking about as well, what reputation is being built from here? And with Hypepotamus, its origins being that it was sort of a co-working space, and for the community of technology here in Atlanta and innovation and these startups who, this was before the WeWorks and the Switch Yards and all of the Atlanta tech villages, all of these things.
Yeah, it was early. It was very early, 2010, 2011, 2012. It was.
But then those things started to show up. And so the need wasn't quite the same. So then it turns into, well, how do you continue to serve a community when a brick and mortar is not, as unique? And that was the moment when they took it online, and it became an online community with news and information that really serves the community. So that's first at Hypepotamus. It's not just to break news. It is, of course, to be of service to the community of VCs and funds and startups and founders and accelerators and everybody who's trying to find out more about it. But then there's also the idea of, we've built this reputation, and that reputation is centered on making sure that we're looking at startups and making sure that they're reputable, because we don't want to just be there to give someone their stamp of approval. And next thing you know, this whole thing looks like it's one of those kind of like, pay to play kind of operations.
Yep.
Because it really is serving community first. And the tech community in Atlanta has been so long coming. And now that it is really a legitimate thing and is only growing, we continue to want to be that place that is respected and admired for just connecting community and telling real stories, as opposed to just this Series C or this fundraising amount or something like that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the Hypepotamus opportunity, you've evolved to that to that opportunity from kind of the music space, right? And so you see this just like this melting pot of backgrounds that are all kind of coalescing and coming together at Hypepotamus, thanks to your leadership, which is pretty cool. So.
It's very similar to the music business too. I told the founder, Ashish Mistry, shout out to him, when I was talking to him about coming to the role, that this reminds me a lot of the music industry in the mid-90s. If you were there, you were there. And if you knew what was going on, you knew that this thing was really taking off. And as we see now, Atlanta is the epicenter of at least hip hop music, which is globally influential. So with Georgia Tech being here, with all of the things that everyone's always said, Atlanta is a true place, a Silicon Valley of the South, or whatever you want to call it. There was just such an opportunity to be there, and to be there while there's enough there to tell a story, but you're still early enough to where you're going to see it continue to go. And it's only going to grow in terms of nothing else, audience and interest.
Well, compare that to your time at Thrillist, because for a good 5 years, you were Thrillist in the South, right? I mean, you you were prolific in writing articles about everything, everything under the sun, culturally, culinary. What was the different feel and vibe of covering from the kind of startup perspective?
Well, there was a lot of startup coverage at Thrillist. It just wasn't as much tech. We were hoping to get more tech, but it was a frenzy. It was a madhouse. I mean, going from zero, I still to this day, it's so interesting to me that people know what I'm talking about when I talk about Thrillist, because when it's just you, as you said, and you're walking up to some new business and introducing yourself, I'm Mike Jordan from Thrillist. We're a new publication, and you give the whole spiel, and people are like, I'm not interested. How do you make your money? I don't trust it if it's not a newspaper. I mean, this type of content was not out there yet, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then
this
to
was
watch,
what, 2013, 14?
Oh no, this was 2000, January 2009. We started. I started there in 2008, and we launched in January 2009. So the only other thing in the market at that time that was comparable was Daily Candy, which is now gone. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were publications like City Search and other things. But this was a new model of a city guide, which was really actionable information, making you the expert in your town on the best new thing to do that day, every weekday. So 5 stories at least a week. We had to beat everybody in town. They would kill your story if you got scooped by anyone who was established. I can tell you today in Atlanta, there were 3 stories that I got scooped on. They were all restaurants, and they were big ones. It was Bistro Nico, Miller Union, and Empire State South. And you don't want to get your story killed at Thrillist, because you have to have a story that's going to run in an email at 4 a.m. every weekday. So, and you can't be beaten. And by the way, a lot of people don't remember that Thrillist was originally a men's publication. So you're now tightening the parameters around what type of content works for this hyper-local publication. So it hardened you. I always tell anybody, if you're looking to hire a journalist and anyone who launched a Thrillist edition is available, hire that person, because they are pretty unbeatable when it comes to getting a story and taking it from I have nothing to I have photography, format, information, PDF or a web link, some humor, and all of those things. So when you take that mentality and then go into the startup side, since I had been so used to doing new things and really introducing you to the hottest new thing, then you also have that discernment of saying, is this a true recommendation? And, obviously Hypepotamus isn't all about recommendations at all. But when we're talking about new places, we at least want to know that there's a there. And what is this that this person is even trying to accomplish? What does this startup mean for the wider community or for the city and the planet? And you really have to do your due diligence of saying, I don't want to waste my time on something that's not interesting, because all of this goes towards building a platform and building on what was already there before I got there. So it's still very intense, but it's enjoyable, and you get such an early look at things, and you get to help tell that story. And it's an invaluable experience as a journalist.
How does the twice a week publication for Hypepotamus feel, knowing the content, right? It's not every day, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but there's still enough content where twice a week it's, come Tuesday, Thursday, stuff is coming out. How does that feel for the information flow that y'all are delivering?
It feels right. And it also, to be honest, it's something that, I come in and look at and say, is this, the best way to continue to serve the community? Because nowadays you see so many more newsletters coming out every day. And, inboxes are just filling up faster and faster. There's a lot of great newsletter content out there. So I don't mean to sound flippant or dismissive about a lot of newsletters, even local ones. But my point is, whether we do once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, this needs to be valuable. This needs to be worth your time, so you look forward to opening it. And if we are not coming with enough stories that we see that the audience is really going to be looking at them, then we need to decide, is that a higher frequency or a lower frequency? Is that a longer email? Is that a shorter email? Yep. Does it rely on more imagery or more dynamic components? Where does the email lead us to? Are people just going there and running straight to the website? Do they want audio content from us? Do they want more video? So it is just like anything else. We are measuring things all the time. So I would say today, twice a week feels great. I would say I'm also literally right now looking at that and saying, I'm not the one who's really in charge here, even as the editor-in-chief. The audience is in charge. If they're the bosses, if they decide that what I'm doing is incorrect, then they fire me or they fire us. And that's the way it really always works. So it's always a listening experience as well as a talking to our audience. We're also getting that feedback at all times.
Well, I'm sure we both share similar sentiments around the number of calls I get, from folks in San Francisco or New York who want to know what's going on in the South, what's going on in Atlanta. So I imagine a lot of those subscribers are also not local because they want to know what's going on. Which brings us to a broader question, right? The growth projections of Atlanta are pretty insane right now. And, looking at the housing market, even post-COVID outbreak, there doesn't seem to be any slowdown in home buyers. How does Atlanta grow responsibly over the next 5, 10, 20 years, still keep its identity, still keep its culture in the next 20 years?
Well, that is the big question. I was talking to someone about that just yesterday, as I talk to people about it all the time. It's if you live in Atlanta, whether you're from here or not, that's something, if you've been here long enough, it is a concern because it's such a magical place. And we have to keep our eyes on the culture of the city. And any place, again, you mentioned it already, I was born in Nashville, but I was raised in Huntsville, Alabama. And Huntsville has, huge per capita income. And, people always remark on, the brain, there's the IQs there just so high because you've got all these engineers and rocket, ship people. So it's a great place in the sense of going to school there and coming up in education. But the culture of Huntsville could absolutely use work. And anyone from there would say this. So it's not for me to knock my hometown. Many writers have complicated relationships with their hometown that go back historically. But Atlanta is a place that can retain talent and continue to grow, not only because of the job opportunities and because of industry and Coca-Cola and everyone that we know has been here and anchoring, but it's fun to live in Atlanta. Yeah. And it's cool to live in Atlanta. And Atlanta is also just undiscovered enough that it feels special. And it feels like there's so much more story that's going to be there to tell. But eventually, it's going to hit a point to where we've told enough of the story. And I think we're kind of secretly there now that everyone's like, let's go check out this Atlanta.
Yeah.
And I do think, to your point about the home buying and selling, I think we're going to get a huge influx of the New Yorkers coming here with COVID and with the urban environments being a little bit whatever. And if jobs aren't coming back quickly enough, they're saying that there's a shift to rural. And the beautiful thing about Atlanta is that it's metropolitan, but it's also, Southern. And it doesn't take much to find yourself in the woods somewhere. I could walk deep into my backyard and probably see something that certain people would shoot and eat. So I think that's coming back. But I do think we have to be very mindful of what type of culture we're building, no matter what we're doing. And that's really how I approach news and information and communication anyway. It's through the lens of culture. How does culture impact the tech community? How does the music business impact broader culture? How does restaurants and how does food and beverage impact the scene in Atlanta for not just recreation and nightlife, but for networking and just the signs of economic opportunities and that whole industry itself? But all of that can be locked in and woven into the fabric of culture that we have. We have to be very careful, whatever we decide to do, about protecting Atlanta's culture.
Yep. And how do we do that?
I think we do that by recognizing that it is a city of lots of different things going on at once. And even though the city is kind of separated, of course, and we have our traffic woes and we have, MARTA doesn't go out to Cobb County and, the east side is way over here. And I live in East Point, which is southwest of the city near the airport. So it's just not as easy or convenient for me to be in all of these places, even though I just get in the car or ride the train and go. But we have to be smart about finding those places where we connect. And especially in a time where folks aren't seeing each other in person. You and I are having this conversation, virtually. We have to make sure that we in Atlanta are staying connected with each other, having conversations about what's important to each of us, because this thing is going to grow one way or the other, but it can grow out of control if we're not talking and making sure that we are, even if not aligned perfectly on what we want to see Atlanta become, we're at least having a dialogue about it. Yep. If we don't know what each other wants, then we're never going to get what any of us want. We're not talking or listening.
So speaking of important movements, saw that you were at kind of the CNN Center during the Black Lives Matter movement and protest in right after the horrific George Floyd murder. And what's it going to take for real progress to be made in the Black Lives Matter movement in Atlanta? Let's start there. And then broader over the next 5-10 years?
Well, Atlanta is certainly exceptional, and that goes back to the history of Atlanta with the Atlanta student movement and the civil rights movement leaders. Obviously, we can always talk about Dr. King and, of course, the recent, passings of two huge leaders, C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. So it has this legacy, and a legacy is not the past. A legacy continues. A legacy is something you build on, even, with college admissions. If you had a father or a brother that goes to Emory or Morehouse, like my older brother went to Morehouse, it's just kind of like they kind of help you continue that. We have to see Atlanta as a continuing legacy. And in the sense of, social justice and racial equality, and as that goes into, police brutality, Atlanta's special because we have a police force that has a lot of representation of different races and ethnicities, women. It feels like this is closer to community policing than some other cities. Now, of course, we had our challenges. We saw in the news with the Morehouse and Spelman student being pulled out of the car, with Rashard Brooks and what happened at the Wendy's on University. So it's not perfect, and it never will be. But as long as we understand the responsibility of any community to not only be policed, but to police the police, because you never can lose the truth in the fact that taxpayer dollars pay police salaries. And the mayors of cities who have a hand in whatever happens with the police force are elected by the people, and their salaries are paid by taxes. So we have to remember our power, and we have to remember with power comes responsibility. We have to make sure that those who are making sure our communities are safe and are protecting and serving are doing that for everyone. Mm-hmm. And, it's like, who watches the watchmen? That's us. We are those people.
And so help us understand what that looks like in terms of, Black Lives Matter and, the next 5 years from an organizational perspective, right? Because, change has to happen, and how does that happen, and that legacy carry on?
Well, Black Lives Matter is such an interesting case because it is not a centralized thing. That's what it's always interesting when people who may say they disagree with Black Lives Matter, it's spoken of as if it is a single organization, and it is absolutely not. It is an idea that has morphed into something that is more of a slogan and a unity that unites under a banner, because the statement is, of course, to say that these lives are valuable. So that's why, of course, when people make the comparison to the All Lives Matter statements, it's kind of like, well, of course, all lives matter, but we're talking about where the problem is currently existing, and that is in America's lack of understanding that when these kinds of injustices happen to African Americans, they speak ill of all lives. So we don't need to focus on the all lives. We need to focus on fixing the problem so that we can make this all lives thing as true as you want it to be, if that's what you prefer to say. Now, I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement is going to need to do some defining, because even if that is going to continue to be a decentralized movement, which there is some wisdom to, I understand, there's also got to be some cohesion around messaging. They do and again, I'm even saying that now, they do. Anyone who unites under the banner of a Black Lives Matter, and anyone who makes that part of their own personal philosophy, the protest movements have been successful, I would say. They've not been pretty in many cases, but we are moving this country in a place of dialogue that didn't seem possible a while ago. I'll give you a little bit of my own personal feelings on this. I think, was it at least last year, but it had been going on longer than that. But last year, I remember there was much debate about the monument at Stone Mountain and the Confederate carving into the rock. And, there was a lot of debate on, well, what do we do and whatever else. And then, these statues, who knew that in 2020 in summer, people would just be taking these things down on their own. So I'm not here to say whether that is the correct thing. Let me make sure I'm clear on this. Confederate statues do not need to be in public places. If you want them in a museum, I'm all for that. But I don't want to see one when I'm in Charleston Square.
No question.
But I will. People are bringing them down themselves. That can be all kind of, problematic things. People are getting issue stuff. It should be something that we do responsibly. So we need to figure out what are the goals, even if that is not dictated to us by a single president or leader or executive. But we're on the right path with this thing. It's loose in a good way. It will probably need to tighten up, because there will not stop being instances where we will probably need to remind America that Black lives, in fact, do matter.
And we're going to take a quick break here and share that this podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business out of Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com. Let's spend a few minutes talking about your family. You've put out on social media, your father is a retired Air Force general, highly respected, performed a real service to our nation. What are some of the lessons you learned from, a father who was a general in the military?
I learned that you have to be a pretty, cold-hearted person when you're a general. And I love my dad and he loves me, but he can tell you something in a way that's like, your feelings mean absolutely nothing to me, because this is what the assignment is and this is how we're going to do it. And then he'll laugh and he'll say, let's get a beer. And I'm like, Dad, I'm 16. He's like, but you learn that Dad didn't get to be a general by accident. It wasn't just a diversity hire. He's a guy who, when it's time to get the job done, he is very analytical, and he has taught me a lot about the benefits of applying logic. So, it's not about anything else. It's like logically, what is point A to Z? Like, how do we logically get there? And that's the kinds of things where you can remove your emotions from something and say, but this is what we have to get to. How do we do it? And one thing he always says to me is, you never quite know what you can do until you have to do it. So when you hear something like that, and when you see him enact it, and you see that the human mind and the drive and desire to actually make something happen, it's really, your potential can be limitless if you decide that it is. That can be very inspiring itself. So he inspires me for sure. And, of course, he was the COO of Atlanta for a year and a few months or whatever. So, I got to see a lot of the inner workings of the city's politics and how City Hall kind of works. And it's just, leadership is what you learn from someone like that. When this is someone who, there are obviously people who are qualified for the position of the rank of general in the armed forces. There are people who are qualified to run a city, but the people who end up doing it, if they are successful, what is it that they are applying? And overall, it always comes back to leadership. You can be a good leader and certainly not the smartest person in the room. you could be a good leader and, take a lot of different visions and sort of aggregate those into a thing that makes sense for you from your vision and your vantage point. Leadership is what I take from him more than anything else. He's just someone who people look to him for answers and guidance, and he doesn't shy away from that. May not always give the best advice. Here's a true story that might make you laugh. He told me that I should seriously consider putting my name in the hat for Congressman Lewis's seat. I was like, calm down a little bit, dude. Like, back off the Jack Daniels, dude. I know we're from Tennessee, but let's get out of Lynchburg for just a minute. Let's bring it back home.
Did it cross your mind?
Well, I'm not going to say that I would not have an interest in politics. I mean, you and I have had conversations before. As the folks back home, we're friends, but I would never close the door on something that was of service. I find myself having not yet done that because, and again, I was definitely not going to run for John Lewis's seat, but I have thought about some local political roles. And the reason why I've not yet done it is because I want to make sure that I have done my due diligence to make sure that I'm really of service. And I'm always questioning myself, is this for me or is this for someone who might decide that I'm worthy of the opportunity to lead?
Mm-hmm.
So until I'm 100% convinced of that, I'm very happy doing my job, and I'm very happy supporting candidates who I think are good, no matter where they come from. But yeah, it's not something that I would be against, of course, but I'm about doing it for the right reasons. I don't need to be famous, a famous politician.
Continuing on the family theme, you kept it under your hat for, I don't know how long. I mean, we've known each other for 10 plus years, and but finally you put it out on social media. So I feel comfortable asking the question around your Godfather, Sidney Poitier. What's it like? I mean, where do I even ask that question? Right? I mean, how has that influence been on your life?
Huge. This is, going back to the whole, the idea of fame. So fame is something that, Andy Warhol said years ago that in the future, everyone would have their 15 minutes. And we are now at that place with social media and other things. But this is a man who wasn't just famous. He's someone that is just, I always tell people he's exactly who you think he is. He's exactly that person. He spends way more time with me than you would expect. He didn't have a son, so he spends a lot of time, and he speaks to me in a way that if you could condense the best wisdom that you could find, that's really distilled down to the purest form of how it can be helpful to you, because there's no motive other than you'll sit and listen to me. I would love to help you and to give you some guidance. And he's told me things that have just come back over and over again to be some of the most rich and helpful and just good information that you could possibly ask for. And I mean, he is someone who, again, he's a humble person. When I've gone to visit him in California, we'll go to, his local organic store, and they know him there, and he's buying his uncured turkey bacon. And, they're asking him what's been up with him, but not in a way of Sidney Poitier, just kind of like, how you been, Mr. P, and stuff like that, or Big Sid. But it's amazing. It really is. And every day I realize how fortunate I am. But I can also say that it has greatly informed my outlook to be from someone like that, who was such a pioneer and a first in demanding respect as a Black man in Hollywood and just in general, and going to the director's role. I always tell people that has a lot to do with why you may see me speak on issues and feel very comfortable speaking about the need for justice and equality. I mean, I come from a guy who, really did some groundbreaking stuff in Hollywood and who has guided me a lot. And it's really embedded in me. My dad, not just a general, but he was the third Black graduate of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. So, these are people. My mom is from Alabama, from more rural Alabama. And, in her lifetime, there were still segregated water fountains that she drank from. So these are people who I've watched her come to be a PhD city planner, and my dad is the general, and I got the Sidney Poitier thing going on. I know lightning struck a whole bunch of times for me, and I see that that's not even exactly fair, because I know a lot of people who are better than me in many ways, and they did not have lightning strike at all once. So I like to use the fact that I know that there's a little bit of a security blanket, even in just wisdom and my confidence in knowing what I can do. Forget the money part. The money could be gone tomorrow. But the confidence instilled in me in that I am no lesser of a person for being African American, and that the hard work that I put in is going to be the benefit that I get out. And therefore it's an owed responsibility to make sure that other people are taken care of. And you have to know that that's part of the job. That's just what kind of sticks out to me more than anything. And he's been a phenomenal, mentor and family member, and just a friend, and great storyteller too.
Well said. Let's transition. I know we're coming up on time here, and I really want to be respectful of your time. What trends do you see, coming back to the Atlanta theme? What trends do you see in Atlanta for the next 5 to 10 years that no one's really talking about?
All right. Well, I think that that's an interesting question for today, because no one really even knows what to say, what's coming with a lot of the changes that we're in, being home and quarantined. But I will say that we are going to continue to have increasing population. I think that we are going to figure out a little bit more of this walkability vision and all of the promises of, the belt lines and the paths and the corridors and all of these things. I think that we're going to have an opportunity to really decide on where that goes, because transit is really one of the things that I think is holding Atlanta back from what it really could be. Mm-hmm. And old way of thinking. And the more we get into what are the benefits and where does that take us as a city and how great could we be? I see that opening up the doors to a lot of different, just an open-minded, open source way of the world. So I do think that the city is, the music industry is a lot different than it was back then. So Atlanta's identity as a music industry center, I don't know what's going to happen there. We'll have to see. I think the movie industry here, I don't think that's going away, but we do, of course, have to see what's going to happen with vaccinations and when the studios get back open. So that's a bigger than Atlanta thing, but it's coming back, of course. And Atlanta will continue to play a huge role as long as that tax credit is still there. I think we will see a lot more design around life in a city that is not, a top 5 in America, but, what does that mean for Atlanta's role in leading culture? And so back to culture. If Atlanta's going to be important and if we're going to continue to make the city great, then what does software look like? What does Georgia Tech look like? What does, people raising their children in Atlanta and taking them to schools and the education system look like, especially with the digital divide being so apparent today? So I think it's going to be solutions driven based on questions that we're just now learning to ask because of this very interesting summer and period we're living in.
Yep. Mike, we always finish the conversation on 2 questions. Why Atlanta, and what has Atlanta done for you?
Why Atlanta? So why Atlanta for me is because I'm a Southerner through and through. And I believe in the South. I believe in everything it has to offer. It's beautiful. We have 4 seasons. And there's also, I always tell people, again, as an African-American man, the number one thing of why Atlanta for me living here, aside from seeing a beautifully, vibrant and diverse, even African-American community. It's one thing to say how diverse the city is, but just as a Black man, there's all kind of Black people in Atlanta. So just that, you don't just have a single type because that was who was in that city. There's every single type of African-American person, which I think can help to even bridge gaps between the weirdos in every race and ethnicity. There's a weirdo for you in the Black community. There's a weirdo for you. But I say that my number one reason for Atlanta, which I don't want this to sound depressing in any way, but it's honestly because I'm never concerned about the police. I'm never concerned about the police. If a police officer pulls me over in Atlanta, I'm like, dude, what's up with this? Like, what's going on? Excuse me, sir? What is this indignity that you are giving me right now? In Huntsville, Alabama, I am both hands on the wheel. I'm looking up like this. I'm doing all of the things that they say you should do. In Atlanta, I've got my feet hanging out the window. It's a beautiful thing. But I love Atlanta. Atlanta has everything going for it. So why Atlanta? Everything. And what has Atlanta done for me? Atlanta has given me an opportunity to identify and discover things about myself that I don't know that I feel as comfortable doing anywhere else in the world. I feel like there's enough here for me to try so many different ranges of things, which is why I've done that. And then I also feel like I don't lose who I am. It's a big city and it's small. Someone had an interesting line they said to me. They said, people, people focus on the trees so much that they forget that they're the skyscrapers. And they said it vice versa. I think I'm mangling that. But what they were basically trying to say is, this isn't a city where you want to ruin your reputation. You can do a lot of things, but it's not big enough that you can do that, because you can be at Kroger, and until he recently passed, you could run into Lewis. You can see an old mayor. You can see your current mayor. You can see anyone in Atlanta, and it's not a big deal. So what it's done for me is it's made me see that up close and personally, we're all connected. Success can be my next door neighbor. It can be me. It can be the person up underneath me or behind me. But it just makes everything seem more realistic and more accessible and possible.
Mike Jordan, really, really appreciate your time today. Thank you for being part of the Atlanta Story.
Thank you, man. I'm glad to have been here. I've been waiting to be here, and have me back anytime.
Thanks so much. This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. It was co-produced by JC Lucas and Jon Birdsong. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business in Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com and the companies we work with who've done it before. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it at your next coffee meeting or dinner greeting, rate it, and write a benevolent, eloquent review.